Up until now, we've been focusing primarily on writing, and one of the key components of writing that we don't think about enough is editing. So that's what we're going to talk about now, about editing your own work, about editing for other people. Being a good editor is paramount to creating good content. So the question is, what is editing? To a lot of us, editing is fixing typographical errors and catching punctuation, AP style, God willing. But there's a lot more to it, and looking at copy both with the macro and the micro view is what will help you make someone else's story better. There is nothing that has ever been written that doesn't need to be edited by someone who is impartial and someone who has a clear perspective on what the reader needs to get out of the article. These are some of the things that you need to think about as an editor. You need to have a passion for these things, and they include spelling, of course, and style and punctuation. But really, you need to think about how all those words come together to form good writing. People who are good editors read a lot. They read good material, they read bad material, they're able to tell the difference between them. And so if you can start to think of yourself as sort of a cultivator of words and how words get put together, you are on your way to being a good editor. We have to think concisely. We're constantly looking at ways we can tighten copy, and that may mean taking things out that writers are in love with, which is why writers don't edit their own stuff. We have to recognize more than just the writing. What else goes into a package, either a print or a web package, artistically, from a design standpoint. We need to understand the legal and ethical ramifications of what gets printed under our watch. We have to be skeptical, and when people come to us with a story that seems too good to be true, maybe it is. Our source is credible. Is this story truly the way that it's being framed? Is it accurate? Is it fair to the reader? So all of these facets are what come together to make an editor's role so important. We have to be able to see double meanings, double entendres in headlines or in writing. I once did a story, and the guy told me, I asked him, what's the best advice you ever got? And he said, candy's not good for you. And, I thought he meant candy, like the kind you eat. I found out later that his ex-wife's name was Candy. It became a big joke. I didn't think it was funny. And if, my editor perhaps had been more aware of double entendre, or I had been, I would have gotten it. So we have to try to think outside what appears to be a conventional picture. You have to have both the self-confidence and the restrained ego to improve another person's writing, but not write it like it's your own. And we've all had editors who rewrite our stuff and makes it look much different than it started out, makes it look more like them, sound just like them. It's incredibly disturbing as a writer. So as an editor, you need to be that person that makes the story better, but still sound like the author. And recognize the buck stops with you. You are the ultimate responsible person for the story. And if there's a problem, if there's an error, you don't throw your writer under the bus. You accept responsibility for it. You use it as a teaching moment for your writer behind the scenes, but publicly, you are the one that takes responsibility. And ultimately, nobody knows what you're doing. This is not a job to get acclaim and fame and awards for. This is something so that other people think better of the people who write for you. So we look at both content and copy when we're editing. Again, that micro and macro view, the copy being the micro view and the content being the macro view. First thing that you do is you read the whole story. You read it all the way through without making changes to it, because you have to see where all the pieces are. You have to see what fits where, how the story flows as a whole. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to edit it thoroughly. So that means you're going to start to look at it from the very first word. What does the reader need to get out of it? What are they getting out of it? Do you need a stronger inverted pyramid style? Do you need it to have more of a feature framework? Is the lead clear? Is the lead pulling the reader in? What's it supposed to be doing? And then after you've done editing it, you have to reread it, because you may have made changes that change meaning or are incomplete or will compromise the integrity of the story. Remember, before you ever get started, if it doesn't make sense to you, it doesn't make sense. So a lot of editors, when they first get started, be like, well, maybe it's just me. And every one of you will think that when you start to edit the work of your classmates. Maybe it's just me. It doesn't matter if it's just you. If it is you, then there's a challenge that we need to address, and we need to make the story better. We have three R's when it comes to copy editing. They are, the copy has to be reader-centered and your focus has to be reader-centered. You have to make copy readable and you have to make the copy right. So what does reader-centered mean? Is this story something that the reader is going to be interested in? Will they be compelled by it? Is this information new? Do they clearly see what the rationale is for them to be reading the story? You need to make sure of that when you're editing it. Is it readable? So is the story been written clearly? Can we tell obviously what the story is about? Do we see either a very clear nut graph or a theme graph? But when we have a question in the copy, is it answered immediately? Are things arranged logically? Is there stuff we need to take out that's irrelevant? Is there something we need to pull out into a sidebar of information because maybe it doesn't fit in the story but it's interesting? Can we use words that maybe people will understand better? I had an editor that used the word Lilliputian. That's a great word. It meant small, and we're writing tightly and we're writing for people who maybe aren't as educated as we may be. We have to use words that they're going to understand and that they can navigate through the story. And do the quotes add something? Are we having facts presented in the quotes? If we are, paraphrase those quotes. Don't ever do the reverse, so we're not ever going to quote a paraphrase, but you can take quotes out of quote and make them into a paraphrase if they're going to be tighter and more efficient for the reader. And ultimately, is this story right? Is it accurate? Is there anything in it legally or ethically that's compromised? Is it tasteful? Do we recognize the sensitivity of the community that we're serving? You have to look for inconsistencies, especially when it comes to spelling. Names will often be spelled two different ways in a story. Tenses are a big challenge. A lot of you are going to face that too. You'll use pronouns, singular pronouns for plural nouns. Are there any typos, grammar issues? These are all the elements that you're going to look at now. So think about that proofreading and copy editing are not the same thing. Once you have taken the macro view and you've made all these changes, now's when you proofread. Now's when you look at spelling and these kind of AP style mistakes. Here's a checklist that I'm giving you just so you can look over this slide and when you're editing a story, check all of these things from an editing standpoint and make sure that it's kind of fitting this. And it's especially going to be relevant when you have working with a print product. When you're in the Lantern, you have content that needs to fit somewhere. But you keep an eye out for repetitive words. If you're going to write a headline, does the headline go with the story? Make sure you've read the story. Is it clear? Are we consistent? These are all facets to think about. The inconsistencies will be a significant inaccuracy that you'll find in stories, figures that don't add up. And that can be, not necessarily the writer's fault. You can have someone who you'll say they're born in 1968 and you'll say this person is 45, but if their birthday is at the end of the year of 2013, then they actually won't be 45 until the end of the year. So we have to make sure that we're accurate. We want to be very careful that we don't pick up facts from past stories that may have been inaccurate in their time. We need to make sure all the reporting is our own and that we don't use these kind of unwarranted superlatives of, this is the biggest or the only. We don't, unless we know that for absolute certain, we have to be very careful because if you call something the first or you call it the biggest and it's not, you have now committed a factual error. A lot of inaccuracies that we'll see. I hate to say this, but writers make up quotes. They don't necessarily make up whole quotes, but they'll modify quotes or they'll just add one sentence. You need to be reading and make sure that the quotes sound consistent and that the tone and the tense and the verbiage don't change. Facts that aren't, we talked about. News that isn't. Is this story really newsworthy? Is this something that would be interesting to the reader? Are these sources biased in some way? Do we need to reflect that? Do we need to balance them? Are we being misleading or inaccurate? Numbers, got to keep your eye on them. Make sure that your AP style is correct. If it's an age, it's going to be a numeral. A temperature, it's going to be a numeral. If we're talking about the seventh person, we're going to write that out. We want to make sure that we round up numbers. So rather than writing out 1,419,226, that we put 1 point something and then write out the word million. Make sure that you're checking your statistics and don't assume if you put a bunch of numbers in it that everybody's going to understand what you're talking about. Numbers confuse people. Make sure that we have the clear information. And then just think about where you're going to make a mistake as an editor. Even though you're a writer, you're looking for your writer to do these things, you're going to be compelled to do them too. That you're going to quote a paraphrase, or you're going to just change a quote a little bit just to make it better. A lot of editors read stories, don't ever read their stories, and they write a headline. That's a big problem. And fundamentally, the biggest mistake you're going to make is rewriting when you shouldn't. If your writer has done a good job, don't rewrite it just because you feel like you need to do something. The goal is for the writer to have as clear a copy as possible, and if it comes in that way, more power to them.